Today we have hearings going on in the Royal Commission, and what are we hearing? We're hearing propaganda, just more and more people being brought as witnesses that are really just trying to say that victims of psychiatrists want to get into psychiatric hospital beds. Like we want to get into their beds. No, we don't. And I said in my submission, because I sent one in, of course, no, I'm not being called as a witness. They don't call people like me because I protest against their system. They're not going to call anybody who protests against their system. They're only going to call the turncoats and the people that back up the system and all the psychiatrists. And you would hope that, if there's a psychiatrist there, that they were being grilled. But no, they're not being grilled. They're not being asked any particular questions. But I do put it to you as the public to look at these pieces, of information that the transcripts that will appear on the site, and look at the words and actually think about what is being said here. Think about what is this jargon that is being touted as scientific, and start to see things really from the perspective of people being arbitrarily detained and tortured, broken under that torture, and forced to say that these things are good for them, or the person's just silenced forever and they don't speak out against the horrible regime again. There are experiments going on that are 10-year studies. All right, 10-year studies of people that got grants from the government medico grant system, around about $800,000 to follow people around, monitor them for 10 years. These are people that have been subjected to forced psychiatry. Now, they wouldn't even know that this is happening. They wouldn't know that they're a part of this trial. All they know is that the psychiatrist keeps wanting to and forcing appointments and forcing them into hospital beds and forcing their drugs and themselves on that person. It's just disgusting. And it has to be stopped. And we're dealing with a corrupt inquiry, so how is it we're going to stop this? I put it to you, the mainstream media has to do something. Now, the mainstream media, they've been having a few troubles of their own with their journalists being targeted for revealing information and so forth, and having their offices raided and so forth. So I think it's about time they really started stepping it up a bit and exposing some of the very, very obvious things that are happening in Victoria today, like they should have been done way back, turn of last century. It should have been abolished back then. It should have at least been abolished in the 70s when there were a whole lot of different rights-based movements that were fighting, and the victims of psychiatrists in general got left behind. And gay rights, they were supposed to not be discriminated against anymore, but I put it to you that that's not really strictly true, because psychiatrists can just call a person any term they want. They don't have to discriminate on the basis of same-sex attraction. They can just use another vicious DSM slur. They don't have to write anything truthful in files. In fact, I put to you that everything in a psychiatric file is pretty much not true. Sometimes they don't even get your name right, and it doesn't. They don't get charged with malpractice or sloppy work or anything like that. It's nothing shifts on this. You have a 3-year window to possibly be able to after you've been incarcerated and harmed by these monsters, these monstrous psychiatrists. You've got a 3-year window in which to lawsuit them for malpractice. But you've got to also understand that being able to get off those drugs and the effects of those drugs are very, very lasting and disabling and horrific, and also as a massive you've been through something that's massively painful. So that 3-year window makes it very, very difficult for people to do that, even in a very obvious case. But even in the very obvious cases of bloody violations, that psychiatrists do them on such a regular basis to so many people that the no win no pay lawyers just don't take these cases, and you'll be forking out a fortune to fight these utter bastards in courts and legal aid. You just don't. They just don't happen. It's like less than 10% of people, subjected to forced psychiatry actually able to get legal aid just once. So it's the legal battle just isn't there. So we've got a legal battle. It's supposed to be a legal inquiry. Australia's highest form of inquiry, it's a politico-legal inquiry into the Victoria's mental health system, and we haven't had one for 133 years. And guess what? You hear Patrick McGorry speak, he just sounds like Berry from way back 133 years ago. You hear a number of psychiatrists speak that they're just exactly like that. They're saying the same things again and again and again. And the amount of people just trying to categorise, put different people in categories exactly like the eugenicists did way back then. So nothing changed for 133 years. I'm living in the town that is supposed to have stopped still, and I tell you what, that system has just stayed still, and we've got to budget. We've got to move it. We've got to change it. It has to shift somehow. It has to be broken. How we're going to do it, there has to be protests. And it has to be from more than the victims of psychiatrists, because you've got to realise that a lot of the victims of psychiatrists, they're being held in arbitrary detention. They're being tortured. And they're being terrified that if they fight, and there's a very real terror that they will be dragged in again and put on the most heaviest dose of these drugs and electrocuted and tied to beds and denied everything that makes life even slightly worthwhile. It's just so utterly horrific. So I'm saying to the public, now is the time. You got to look at these Royal Commission things, and I would really love the comedy scene to get into it. I'd really love it if they could recognise that this stuff does need to be talked about, not as in the way that the turncoats talk about it, because there's a whole lot of that as well. They tried to take a bite into that, and it was just about making it funny for the white coats, which is very very strange, isn't it? But that's usually what happens in an exploitation racket, is that you do the dance for the exploiters, but that's not it. That's not what you want to do. So let's get this happening. It just protest first. I think try and comedy before we get any kind of breakthrough with protest is very hard. It wouldn't make sense to anybody, not really. That's what I'm thinking, except, the very in crowd of protesters. And then we're going to have the mainstream media actually reporting the reality of what is happening rather than the propaganda, because it is just, the propaganda is so thick. That means talking to the protesters, the people who are actually saying, we want an abolition of forced psychiatry. We don't want a mental health system. We don't want to be forcefully drugged. Now, that's not too much to ask, because you've got to actually say, you can't actually be pro-human rights. The Mental Health Act is anti-human rights. Totally anti-human rights. It denies Australian citizens the basic human rights. It also denies residents basic human rights and visitors to Australia basic human rights, because the Australian psychiatric system can grab visitors to Australia as well, and I've actually witnessed this happen. Okay, so let's do something about this. Let's tell the government of Victoria that we're not okay with this farce of a Royal Commission. We're not okay with having psychiatrists appointed in this Royal Commission, and we want forced psychiatry abolished. We want to do what was suggested by the United Nations CRPD committee. Now, I think for an international organisation, them telling Australia that forced psychiatry is wrong and putting up legislation that enables a country like Australia to be able to implement the idea of pro-human rights legislation that does not allow for the discrimination on the basis of disability. Now, I would say mental health legislation is more about the idea of discriminating on the basis of accused disability, because it is a disputed area of disability, because basically psychiatrists are accusing a person of being disabled. Now, whether that accusation is true, valid, or there is a disability there, but it's not what the psychiatrist is saying, is not a reason to go to force medicines of any kind, particularly the kind that psychiatrists do, which is just human research, and it's just taking a vulnerable person and subjecting them to some awfully horrible, torturous experiments for no support for the person, and then denying them the right to speak out against that violation, and psychiatrists then and their system making a lot of money out of exploiting these people for human research. So to accuse a person of a particular label, which is a vicious DSM slur, to give them that and discriminate on the basis of that accused disability is what the Mental Health Act of Victoria does. But the CRPD says it doesn't matter, whether the disability is true or not. You're still discriminating on the basis of disability. Don't do it in Australia. And Victoria is part of Australia, and Australia has not implemented the CRPD at all. It said it would, but it hasn't. And then if the federal government uses the whole idea of the separation of states to not deny implementing it. But here's the thing, psychiatrists regularly are violating the Code of Human Research, which is their code, it's a federal code, and police could step in. Here's the thing, police could step in and they could prosecute psychiatrists in their facilities that are conducting this forced human research. They could do a criminal prosecution. Why isn't that happening? Well, we need to get lawyers, police, and government legislators, but most especially mainstream media on board to be able to do these things. It can't just be victims of psychiatrists speaking out, because victims of psychiatrists are being denied platforms because they're speaking out against the system that makes a lot of money for a great number of various people. But it makes money out of human flesh, and it is exploitation of a vile, cruel kind. And people have really got to start thinking, do they want to say that I lived in that area and I did nothing and I was part of it? You know, if you are you part of that and you're writing propaganda and things like that, I mean, that's disgusting. Is that something you want to tell your grandchildren that you did?